Greetings, I'm Roberto Valdez, Master of the Science of Geography and instructor at Northern New Mexico College in Española, New Mexico. This topic is about the seismic activity occurring in the American Southwest, El Norte Mexicano. We're going to discuss volcanoes, faults, earthquakes, tectonic movements of plates, and other interesting subjects to explain how in the world the American Southwest and El Norte Mexicano came into existence as a piece of the continent. Your learning objectives will be to learn that the Earth has a crust. It's fractured into these plates called tectonic plates, and that there are faults, that is cracks of the Earth, that move and generate heat. Learn that the landscape of the American Southwest, El Norte Mexicano, has unique regions of terrain called physiographic provinces. You're going to understand what the Rio Grande Rift is, a major landscape feature in New Mexico that explains and within which much of New Mexico's history is set. And you will also learn about volcanic activity associated with stress points in the Earth, especially where it relates to El Norte Mexicano. You'll become familiar with different types of volcanoes that exist, the different types with different degrees of violence, and that give the mountains that they build a different appearance. You'll learn also how lava flows sculpted much of the landscape of New Mexico. The western portion of the United States is higher in elevation than the rest of the United States. What gave the western part of the United States such high elevation? Throughout planet Earth, the crust has cracks in it, plates that rub up against each other and cause seismic activity. Marked in yellow, you'll notice how strong it is around the Pacific Ocean, especially in that part that is here, Japan, Indonesia, and so forth. There's also some activity here in the western part of the North American continent. Less than, of course, in other places, but significant enough to try to be used to explain how the El Norte Mexicano and the American Southwest came into existence. The west coast of the United States has what they call fault lines. Those are cracks in the earth that have active movements of stress, where one particular part of the crust rubs up against the other and causes these gentle movements. That's when they don't move, but cause binding. The sudden release of binding releases lots of energy, which is known as an earthquake. In California, fault lines are visible on the landscape. The famous San Andreas, really it's San Andres, there's no such saint as San Andreas, forms a famous fault line, the source of many earthquakes. There isn't just that, there are many other fault lines, sometimes hidden a mile beneath the surface. But in this case, it's very obvious that the Arroyo Channel once flowed straight downhill along this slope, and has since had to take a bend in it due to the movement, the active movement of two separate bodies along the fault line. In the west coast of the United States, running all the way up to through Canada, is this zone called a subduction zone. Subduction is when a plate, in this case the Pacific plate, is diving in and rubbing up under the North American plate, which is riding on top of it. Now, of course, this subduction is occurring offshore, but nevertheless demonstrates its presence by miles in the interior, the eruption of volcanoes. The subduction, as you can see here, is the crust diving underneath. A melting takes place, and these bodies of magma start to move upward. They're called diapers. And they move upward and cause an enormous release of gases, of heat, of ash, and occasionally actual lava flowing out on the surface. As mentioned before, plates are rubbing up against each other, some of them diving underneath the other one, or rubbing up sidewise against it. An example can be seen here in the western United States. This is an animation of what the North American continent looked like 20 million years ago, running up to the present day. And you'll notice that one of the things that is obvious is how the plate is tugging at the North American plate and actually drawing it out. And as you can see, Baja California, once an integral part of what we would call today's mainland Mexico, has been detached and is slipping upward and northward. Notice also the lighter colored reddish beige color indicated by the sign of basin and range. This is a territory, a type of what they call physiographic province, characterized by the pulling apart of the continent. And I'll explain that in a moment. But just bear in mind that that this pulling has opened up the North American plate like an accordion. Illustrated here on the top is the compressional forces, and on the bottom the extensional forces. Now, for the most part, extensional forces have been more dominant in the creation of the western part of the North American continent, especially the western United States. These extensional forces essentially are when the North American plate is opening up or stretching out like an accordion, opening up all of these ridges of mountains. Compressional forces also occurred, shown on the upper illustration, in which occasionally there were forces that collided or pushed together the plate and created these wrinkles and raised up mountains. So 400 miles inland, activity that is occurring offshore has an effect in the interior of the continent. Let me introduce you to the physiographic provinces. A physiographic province is a particular region with a uniform character of terrain and geology. And so in this you will see that there's general uniformity of features on the surface and on the geological structures or the roots underneath. A simple way of looking at it is, in other words, a region with unique surface terrain and geology different from its surroundings. So the continent is subdivided into these regions, and we'll review them further in a moment. There are 7 of them that I want you to remember: the Colorado Plateau, the Southern Rocky Mountains, the Basin and Range, and the Great Plains. Both of them are quite dominant in the American Southwest, El Norte Mexicano. I should not omit from this the Sierra Madre Occidental, the Altiplanicie Mexicana, or Central Mexican Plateau, and the Sierra Madre Oriental. All of these play a role in this larger region that we need to cover in order to discuss further its peculiars and its history, the human history. Here they are spelled out for you: Basin and Range Province, the Colorado Plateau, the Great Plains Province, the Southern Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Madre Occidental, Sierra Madre Oriental, and Altiplanicie Mexicana. The forces involved the pulling of the North American plate, opening it up like an accordion, as I referred to earlier. The major fault lines in this illustration are in red, and you'll notice they run up the western coast of the North American continent. With some exception, you'll notice that Southern California and Baja California are on the other plate, the Pacific plate. Nevertheless, this collision is what causes the seismic activity, earthquakes, volcanoes, and also created the vast territory of the interior that is the American Southwest, El Norte Mexicano. When the plate, that is the North American plate, was pulled open, it opened up like an accordion, and mountain chains formed that were very long, north and south. It's almost like the ridges and ribs of an accordion itself. Here is pictured Nevada. Nevada has the most mountain ranges of any state in the Union, And that is because of the pulling apart of the continent created these long north-south, roughly north-south, chains of mountains interdispersed by long valleys. So it happened approximately 20 million years ago, and 100% of its original width was stretched out and created approximately 400 mountain blocks and sediment-filled valleys. And the thing is, the North American continent is not static. It is still actively trying to stretch itself out. You may have heard the reference to the Four Corners states: Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. These political entities are laid upon a very ancient geographic province, physiographic province, called the Colorado Plateau. It started moving into its shape 500 million plus years ago with the formation of its layers of sandstone. And there is believed to be a hot spot underneath the crust that has gently lifted it upwards as there was activity in the stretching and opening up of the North American continent referred to earlier. So this very high barrier proved an obstacle to rivers trying to flow and erode their way down to the ocean. In this case, the very famous Rio Colorado, or Colorado River, carved itself a deep canyon, the Grand Canyon, due to the fact that this Colorado Plateau is in the way. So it sawed its way through down to the lower levels. While the Colorado Plateau was on the rise, and the basin and range region was opening up, a major opening occurred up and down the center of this, what is today the state of New Mexico. It's called the Rio Grande Rift Valley. So the crust stretched open, hot spots formed, and one of the things that characterizes the Rio Grande Rift Valley, as along with other of these valleys that are in the basin and range province, is that they fill in with sediment and that there are long mountains running north-south. So examples of these can be found in East Africa and Lake Baikal in Siberia. But suffice to say that this Rift Valley that we have here in New Mexico is bordered by mountains mostly on the east of it, but also on the west. And the center part is filled in with lots of sediment. The Rio Grande flows right down through it. The San Luis Basin, which is in today's southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, the Española Basin, the middle Rio Grande Basin, from which is Albuquerque, and the rest south of Socorro, running all the way into what we now would call Texas and Chihuahua. This region started opening up on the south end about 36 million years ago, and the north end then started to rip open around 26 million years ago. So as much as 15,000 feet of sediment, that's roughly 3 miles deep of dirt, has filled in and forms what we would value as wonderful aquifers that feed the cities of the Rio Grande Valley, from Alamosa all the way down to El Paso. Here is the Rio Grande Gorge, and on the left is a image of the with lots of highlights of the Rio Grande Rift. Now it's widening about 5 millimeters per year, and it has numerous faults. It's 800 miles long, and it's about 6 times deeper than the Rio Grande, but it's filled in with alluvium, or that is gravels and sand and so forth, forming these sedimentary layers. And this is what the sedimentary layers would look like if we were able to cut away at them and of course add a lot of color. So as you can see, the layers, although they're kind of uniform and horizontal, they're fractured with these faults that run roughly up and down. So these faults of course lead to active activity. In this case, on the right hand side, let me point it out to you, the Sierra Sandia, the Sandia Mountains, have risen upward, whereas that part which is marked here by the Rio Grande itself, where Albuquerque would be, is on the way downward a little bit. The southern Rocky Mountains rose up about 20 to 12 million years ago, and then another thrust occurred about 1 million years ago. And the southern Rocky Mountains have different ranges, but one of the most famous one is called the Sangre de Cristo. And really, for the longest time, it was actually known as the Sierra Nevada, just like the one in California, although New Mexico had its own Sierra Nevada, or Snowy Mountains. Recently, in the past 100 years, the name Sangre de Cristo was promoted because it sounds more romantic, right? Large portions of this are made of a rock that was really formed deep under the crust of the earth and now exposed to the atmosphere. So the rock is characterized as being called metamorphic, and there are three kinds: igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. And sedimentary rock is mostly made like sandstone, and igneous is formed by volcanoes, and this metamorphic is that rock formed deep inside the crust. New Mexico does have earthquakes, and you'll notice an anomaly is concentrated right around the middle of the state of New Mexico, called at the city of Socorro. There's other activity running up and down the Rio Grande Rift Valley, as well as off to the sides out in the Great Plains to the east, and along here the edge of the San Juan Basin to the Colorado Plateau to the west. But this concentration has an explanation around Socorro. It is a body of magma. You'll recall that magma rises up and will eventually emerge as a volcano. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Sometimes they just stay as a magma body underneath the ground. But it does cause some instability, and so very mild earthquakes are felt in the area around Socorro. It's 12 miles deep. Intersecting with this Rio Grande Rift Valley, running diagonally from northeast and southwest, is this large flaw in the crust called the Jemez lineament. The Jemez lineament is basically a large series of fault lines or cracks in the earth from which vents will occur. That is, vents from which form volcanoes or lava flows. So you'll notice here the color reddish running here along the lineament are areas in which there are volcanic rocks. That is, black basalt, usually around Raton, near Las Vegas, especially here along Taos, near Santa Fe, in a place called Caja del Rio, and of course the mountains themselves called the Jemez Mountains, the Mount Taylor, Sierra San Mateo, and Mesa Cebolleta near Grants, running all the way to St. John's or San Juan, Arizona. Here are some volcanoes in the western United States that some of them are active or showed past activity, or will potentially show activity one of these days in the future. Lassen Peak erupted about 100 years ago. And then, of course, you have Mount St. Helens that erupted in 1980. Now notice here in New Mexico we have Bandera Field, and in Arizona we have the San Francisco Field. And of course they're inactive, but the thing is they do have deeply set bodies of magma and activity deep inside the crust. Now here's an example of a crack in the earth that was filled in by magma. Now it's called magma when it's under the surface. When it emerges to the surface, it's called lava. And so when magma goes up and squeezes itself up a crack, sometimes it won't make its way to the surface. It will just stay there and then cool very slowly. And then when the surrounding softer soil or rock is eroded away, it leaves these peculiar things they call dikes, and that's what you are seeing. An intrusive dike is what they call it. And this right here is the old plug of a volcano. So this is a volcanic neck. And this is an intrusive dike right here, listed here on our center part of our list. You have shield volcanoes, cinder volcanoes, calderas. You have surface intrusion, that is where magma breaks out to the surface and forms lava flows. You have shield volcanoes, cinder volcanoes, caldera volcanoes, and Mars. And let's have a closer look at what these things are. Here are 6 types of volcanoes, and we can roughly say that the ones that are most gentle are up at the top list, and the ones that are most violent are on the bottom. Fissure volcanoes are basically cracks in the earth from which emerges lava. We have shield volcanoes and dome volcanoes that also do the same thing but build mountains, as do these ones at the bottom. They all build mountains as well. Cinder is a very light and porous material, a rock that has a lot of foamy bubbles in it. Basalt usually is more solid, but it can have bubbles in it. Pumice, the lightest rock on earth, you can get pure pumice to float on water. And then there's porphyritic rocks, and porphyritic rocks are basically rocks that were one of these other categories, usually basalt, and at different levels of cooling with different sizes of crystals that have now been blown and heated up together and fused together, so that you have this rock that has different sized crystals and fusings of rock together. That's what a porphyritic rock is. So we have two different types of lava, and one is called effusive and the other one is called eruptive. Effusive lava is gentle, eruptive lava is violent. So effusive lava can make shield volcanoes, and lava flows and cinder volcanoes are usually found with them. They flow along the ground and form these vast fields of basalt rock that, when cool, start to slowly over time crack and form these very rough, bad lands. And that's what they were called in Spanish, malpais, or badlands. Here's an example of a lava flow that flowed out. There's no perceivable volcano, but nevertheless it created this vast mesa, about 12 miles long and 3 miles wide at its widest part. It is immediately north of Española. If we could say it forms the northern border of the Española Valley. It's close to Velarde, Alcalde, and Chamita, and it's very flat on top. On the upper left is a photograph of what it's like to stand at the edge of the mesa looking down, and there's a lot of these peculiar benches called hijaderos, where sheep herders used to take the sheep so that they could have their lambs. Now the cap rock in certain places is only 15 feet thick, but there are places where it's up to 70 feet thick. That's a small cliff. It flowed out 3.3 million years ago. And here's another one. This one flowed out for about 3 decades, roughly. And it's about 10 to 15 meters thick. Meter is similar to a yard if you don't understand that. And it flowed out for 46 miles. And so one of the peculiar things is that you see some borrowing from the Hawaiian language by geologists to tell you the different types of lava flow that exists. And one of them, the one shown on the lower left photograph, is called pahoho, or as we call it in New Mexico Spanish, barras tostadas, or toasted bars. It's basically a semi-liquefied rock that is starting to push and form these wrinkles. And then it solidifies. It cools and it solidifies into this form that looks like numerous bars side by side. This one is called the Malpais de Carrizoso, which is in south central New Mexico, also known as the Valley of Fire State Park. And this is the same place, Valley of Fire State Park, and you can see the different types of lava. So what happens is when the lava surface cools, the center is still liquefied. And so oftentimes this strong push of the liquid is still rolling and pushing as the upper part becomes hard. So then it breaks. A crust starts breaking into fragments and getting tumbled and upended. That's what you see here in this photograph. Here you see a small hole that is likely a hollow wherein the liquid lava was still flowing while the outside was rather solidified. Here you see a bunch of those barras tostadas, or pahoho, in which wrinkles formed as the lava started to push and solidify. And then you see these other upended fragments here as the liquefied lava sometimes pushed up against something solid and then released by going upward instead of laterally and pushing up the hardened crust, trying to get it out of the way. Here's another view of this. Now you can see the numerous wrinkles of once liquefied rock flowing and pushing and forming these wrinkles, and then further action from far afield kept pushing and pushing and causing these lava fields to open up and crack and bulge upward. This one is called the Macartes. It's 3,000 years old. This one is near Grants. It's different than the one in Carrizoso. It's often just called simply El Malpais, and it was named by the Spanish because crossing these things to get from one place to another involved the wearing out of your boots or the horse's hooves. So here's the vast field of El Malpais near Grants, New Mexico, San Rafael, New Mexico. This vast field of magma that pushed upward burst out and then slowly began to spread out across a large plain, and then met up with several barriers, slightly higher ground, or in this case a sandstone cliff. So vesicular basalt basically is a black rock with little bubble holes in it. That's what is indicated by vesicular. Often we just call it basalt, but if it has a lot of little holes in it, it's called vesicular basalt. Here's an extinct shield volcano called the Cerro San Antonio. It is on the highway from Española to Antonito, Colorado. Now, what's characteristic about shield volcanoes is that they look like a shield, roundish and broad. And this one was from activity that was a lot more gentle, but nevertheless persistent, because this mountain is pretty high, reaching up to 10,000 feet in elevation. On the west side of Albuquerque, and what they call the Llano de Albuquerque, what you'll often hear in popular reference as the West Mesa, is a place of volcanic activity. There's little mountains there. 3 of them are quite prominent. One is called J.A. Vulcan, and the other one La Boca Negra. And the last one, La Boca Negra, meaning the black mouth, is because it actually has a cave, a lava cave, in which the liquefied lava flowed out and left this hollow in this small mountain. And then there's, along this area, there are also a series of cinder cone volcanoes. Now, this volcanic area left as its legacy a large escarpment of black rock that was that turned darker with the action of weathering, in which the ancient people pecked into it their symbols and their likely to tell stories, likely to leave their mark behind. It's called the Petroglyphs National Monument today. An example of an extinct cinder volcano, and you got to remember about cinder volcanoes, is that they tend to have craters, but not all the time. This one is called Cerro Capulin, and you'll often hear it mispronounced as Capulin, but Capulin means chokecherry. It's derived from an Aztec Indian word that was picked up by the Spanish for this peculiar type of berry that grows and is usually able to be harvested around early August. This delicious little berry has a tart, sharp taste to it that makes your mouth suck in. But this type of bush likely was found growing on its slopes and gave rise to the name for this mountain. They've built a road to it so that you can visit the crater. It is a national monument that is able to be visited. An ash cinder volcano tends to have a lot of what they call escoria, which is a foamy, dark red rock that in crushed to bits form is used to spread on highways during the winter to prevent accidents due to ice. Then there's the violent eruptive lava volcano. And this one, for example, you have composite volcanoes and caldera volcanoes that exhibit this eruptive violence. So you have these subduction zones that I referred to earlier, where one plate slips beneath another, and then it causes these large diapers or large bodies of magma to go upward, melt their way up through the rock and find vents, which then explode. These explosive volcanoes tend to be violent, of course, and they build up lots of rock and gas because of the pressure building up against cracks that are just not big enough for it to relieve pressure, and finally it builds up enough pressure to just cause an explosion. Now, as you can see on the illustration on the left, sometimes a magma chamber will find multiple chambers, or multiple, I should say, vents by which to release the pressure and build a main volcano with a lot of side vents coming out of the volcano. So here's an example of one of these composite volcanoes with branches in it, in its lava vents. This one you can clearly see, I'll point it out right here, the crater. The highest point is here and here, and this volcano essentially blew out its side. So that's why this crater forms more of a C shape than a round crater. And all of this flowed out. All of this that you see that is forested, it's actually a forest, covers a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of volcanic type rocks, mostly basalt, but there are other types. So this is what they call the Mesa Cebolleta. There are two of them. This one is often called the Cerro San Mateo or Mount Taylor, and is a very prominent mountain in central western state of New Mexico. So last eruption was 2.5 million years ago approximately. Out throughout this mesa, I can testify myself that there are a lot of little mountains out here, or hills, that are essentially small volcanoes, branches of the main lava vent. This is an example of a caldera. Now, caldera is basically a large pot to boil lots of soup to feed 50 men. That's what a caldera means in Spanish. So this word is borrowed into English for use in geology. And of course, as you can see, it has a very large rim, like a big pot. But there's a lot of dome mountains inside of it. And that's one of the things that characterizes these caldera volcanoes. This thing is 13.5 miles from rim to rim in diameter. And it just blew up. And it left a large amount of dust and ash that spread all the way to Kansas, several hundred miles away, and created this very large volcanic region of mountains called the Jemez Mountains. But they're also known in Spanish as the Sierra de los Valles. And the reason is because of all these valles, or valleys, these high mountain valleys. There's several of them. This one is called Valle San Antonio, Valle Toledo, and this one Valle Grande, or the Big Valley. Toledo is the last name of a person, and Valle San Antonio the name of a saint. The mountains that you see in here enter in afterwards. After the mountain has blown its top away, then these protrusions start to build these little dome mountains inside the crater. And that's what these are, dome mountains. That is, dome as in rounded top mountains. So here's an example of volcanic necks, and there are two famous ones. One is more famous than the other, actually. This one is Shiprock, and in the imaginary volcano that once existed around it, this was the core of it, the neck of it. Everything else got washed away, and so has left nothing but the actual core of it that is famous in northwestern New Mexico. In Navajo, or the Diné language, it's Tse Bitai, or winged rock. Another famous one is called in Spanish the Cerro Cabezon, the Big Head Mountain. And the Navajo legend holds that everywhere you see lava flows, that's blood from a giant who was decapitated by hero twins. And this is the giant's head here with the blood around it. That's likely that myth was learned by the Spanish, and that's why they applied the Spanish name to it as Cerro Cabezon, or big-headed mountain. And it does look like a big head, does it not? But can you believe it was once the neck of a larger mountain? So here's Shiprock, what it looks like. Now, the other name for it for the longest time is the Needles. It's obvious why. Lots of bunches of sharp vertical rock precipices. Here is another example of an intrusive dike that I had shown you earlier. So this is a subsurface intrusion. In other words, it didn't emerge out into the open. It was making its way to the surface but never quite made it, and then solidified, cooled. And as a consequence of erosion, taking away the softer material, it leaves this long wall-like structure. This one has a window in it. It's called Cuchilla de la Ventana, and the actual window itself is called La Ventana, or the window. Cuchilla means knife edge. That's the Spanish New Mexico place name for it. Cuchilla de la Ventana, or knife edge of the window. This is a mar, double A. And these mars are unusual in that you have the collection of magma trying to emerge to the surface, finding an aquifer, heating it up, and then causing a large dome to form in the earth until finally, boom, it just explodes and leaves a large crater. And then later on there might be some further action. In this case, the Zuni Salt Lake, which is in west central New Mexico in a very remote area, is also close to a salt dome, as well as being with an aquifer. So this the explosion of a mar left it forming a salt lake. So the water can dissolve salt, brings it to the surface in the form of springs, lays it out as a flat pan on the bottom of the lake of white salt, and the waves lap up on shore and with dissolved salts, and so the entire shoreline is crusted with salt as well. But another peculiar thing is right here there's a small cinder volcano. This cinder cone has a crater, has its own little tiny lake, but is made entirely of cinders that erupted in the aftermath because the mar wasn't finished taking action. Here's some place names that I want you to get to know and to learn, and you should rehearse them in your mind in order to get to know New Mexico better. So we have here marked out the Colorado Plateau. We have Shiprock pointed out for you here that we saw earlier. The Jemez Mountains with a big caldera of the Valle Grande right here. The Mount Taylor and the Sierra Cebolleta right here. We have the El Malpais just south of that. This is near the city of Grants. Then we have the Valley of Fire. This is the Malpais de Carrizoso right in here in the south central part of New Mexico. You have another volcanic action right here in the middle of what they call the Jornada del Muerto, lesser known. This is a large area of dunes, of white sand dunes. They call it the White Sand Dunes. This area right here of the Guadalupe Mountains is made of limestone, and right at its among its many ridges are caves, and one of the famous ones is Carlsbad Caverns. In eastern New Mexico, there's this large area of Great Plain, very flat country and elevated, like a plateau. It's called the Llano Estacado, or Staked Plain. Llano Estacado. Right here is one of the largest mesas in the western United States. It's called the Mesa del Chupadero. Another extremely large mesa, a little bit larger I would say, is Mesa de la Glorieta, right here on the southern end of the Rocky Mountains, herein named Sangre de Cristo, the Sangre de Cristo range. Sangre de Cristo Mountains, also known as the Sierra, which is chain of mountains or range, Sierra Sangre de Cristo, Blood of Christ range. All of this area here called the Las Vegas Plateau and Raton Plateau is also a volcanic region, and here is where we saw that cinder cone that is a national monument now that you can drive up into its crater, called Cerro Capulín. Let's review. In summation, I believe you have learned that Earth has a crust. It's fractured into what they call tectonic plates, and further fractured into what they call faults. They move and generate heat and sudden movement, sometimes as in the form of earthquakes. They also are from which vents of magma emerge to the surface. You've also learned that the Southwest del Norte has unique regions of terrain and also geology underneath called physiographic provinces. You've come to understand that the Rio Grande Rift is this big rip in the earth from the stretching of the North American continent, running right north-south through the states of Colorado, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, and is up to 3 miles deep, filled with sediment. and where the crust is thin and where the volcanic activity came to the surface. It's also through which the Rio Grande flows. You've learned how volcanic activity is associated with stress points in the earth, that is, cracks that open up, vents that allow magma to emerge. You've become familiar with the different types of volcanoes. Eruptive and effusive lava come out of some of these. Some of these are gentle, some of these are violent. You've also come to understand how lava flows have created major landforms in the state of New Mexico, such as the Malpais de Carrizoso and the El Malpais near Grants, as well as many other places like our own Mesa Prieta near Española and Cerro Capulín in the northeast of New Mexico. This concludes our presentation on seismic activity of Greater New Mexico, or the Southwest El Norte.